There is a version of the Vietnam War that most people think they know. They know the protests, the helicopters, the napalm photographs, the fall of Saigon. They know the names that get repeated in documentaries and the quotes that get printed in history books. And for a long time, that version of the war served a particular purpose. It explained the conflict in a way that made sense of the confusion, that gave the chaos a shape, that allowed people on every side of the debate to point at something and say, that is what went wrong. But the problem with that version is not that it misunderstood the war. The problem is that it was never really trying to understand it in the first place. The Vietnam War was not a tragedy of misunderstanding. It was a sustained and deliberate act of misrepresentation, carried out simultaneously by military planners, political officials, unit commanders, intelligence analysts, and the soldiers themselves, all for different reasons, all producing the same result, which was a picture of a war that bore almost no relationship to what was actually happening on the ground. That distinction matters. Misunderstanding implies good faith efforts that fell short. Misrepresentation implies something else entirely. It implies that somewhere in the chain of command, at multiple points and over multiple years, people who knew the truth chose to report something different, not always out of malice, sometimes out of self-preservation, sometimes out of exhaustion, sometimes because the truth was so strange and so disorienting that putting it into an official report would have required admitting things that the entire institutional framework of the American military was not designed to absorb. So the reports got written a different way, the numbers got adjusted, the language got softened or hardened depending on what the audience needed to hear. And the war continued. It continued for a very long time after any coherent strategic purpose had dissolved. And the soldiers who were inside it, the ones who were living through the actual texture of the conflict, they knew things that they were not supposed to say. Some of those things were formally classified, some were informally suppressed, the kind of suppression that happens not through official orders but through the collective understanding that certain observations would not be welcomed, would not be recorded, would not travel up the chain. Some of the things they knew were simply too strange, too ambiguous, too corrosive to the official narrative to fit inside any available framework for reporting them. This is an account of some of those things, not all of them. The full inventory of what was hidden, distorted, ignored, or quietly buried in the Vietnam War would require something much longer than this. But some of the most significant gaps, some of the most revealing contradictions between what was reported and what was experienced are worth examining in careful detail. Not because examining them produces outrage or because they support any particular political argument, but because they tell you something precise and important about what happens to an institution, to a military, to individual human beings, when the gap between official reality and lived reality becomes wide enough to walk through. The war in Vietnam was, from a very early point, a war being fought on two separate tracks simultaneously. There was the war that was being reported upward through the chain of command, compiled into briefings, translated into statistics, and presented to civilian leadership as evidence of progress. And then there was the war that was happening in the jungle, in the delta, in the highlands, in the villages, in the minds of the men who were actually there. These two tracks diverged early, and they never converged again. Understanding that divergence, understanding how it happened and what it produced, is the only way to begin making sense of what the Vietnam War actually was. Begin with the most basic building block of military reporting, the body count. The body count became the primary metric of success in Vietnam relatively early in the American involvement, and it became central to the war's logic in a way that turned out to be catastrophically distorting. The idea behind it was straightforward enough. In a war without clear territorial objectives, without front lines that could be drawn on a map and moved to show progress, some other measure of success had to be found, and the body count seemed to offer that. If the enemy was losing more soldiers than it could replace, then the war was being won. The math appeared simple, the application appeared measurable, and the metric appeared objective in a way that political arguments about strategy never could be. The problem was that from the moment body counts became the primary measure of success, they ceased to be accurate. The corruption happened at every level simultaneously, and it compounded as numbers moved up the chain. At the most basic level, in the field, after a firefight or an airstrike or a sweep through a village, soldiers were asked to count the enemy dead. This sounds like a simple task. In practice, it was anything but. Enemy combatants often recovered their own dead before American forces could reach them. Bodies were sometimes buried quickly by villagers. In areas of heavy vegetation, casualties from airstrikes or artillery were frequently impossible to count with any precision. And so estimates were made. And those estimates had a consistent directional bias, which was upward. Not always because soldiers were deliberately lying, though that happened too, but because the incentive structure made overestimation the path of least resistance. A commander who reported high enemy casualties was demonstrating effectiveness. A commander who reported low casualties was implicitly raising questions about his own unit's performance. So the estimates grew, and as they traveled up the chain of command, they grew more. A platoon sergeant's field estimate became a company commander's report, which became a battalion commander's briefing figure, which became a division-level statistic, which eventually made its way into the aggregate numbers that MACV, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, compiled and presented to the Secretary of Defense and ultimately to the President. By the time those numbers arrived at the top of the chain, they had been transformed in ways that no one fully understood or tracked. And the men at the top, the men making strategic decisions, were working from data that their own subordinates knew to be unreliable. This was not a secret in Vietnam. It was one of the most widely known and least officially acknowledged facts about the war. Soldiers talked about it. Junior officers talked about it. There were internal military studies that documented the problem. There were analysts at various points in the intelligence community who raised serious questions about the validity of the numbers. None of this changed the fundamental reliance on body counts as the primary indicator of progress, because changing that reliance would have required admitting that the entire measurement framework for the war was broken, and that admission would have made it impossible to continue presenting the war as one that was being won. The body count problem bled into a related and equally significant distortion, which was the treatment of civilian casualties. This is where the misrepresentation became not just institutionally inconvenient, but morally significant in ways that the official record almost entirely erased. The designation of casualties as enemy combatants versus civilians was not a neutral or objective process in Vietnam. It was a categorization that happened under pressure, in uncertain conditions, with institutional incentives pushing in a consistent direction. The rule of thumb that developed in some units, informally, never in any official document but embedded in practice, was essentially this: anyone who was dead in a free-fire zone was a combatant. The logic was circular. Free-fire zones were areas where anyone could be shot on sight. Therefore, anyone shot in those areas was, by the nature of having been there, an acceptable target. And acceptable targets, once killed, became enemy combatants. And enemy combatants became body counts. What this meant in practice was that a significant portion of the civilian deaths caused by American operations in Vietnam were systematically reclassified, at the point where counting happened, as enemy kills. This was not a dramatic conspiracy. It did not require orders or coordination. It simply required the application of a consistent, definitional framework that served the interests of everyone involved in producing the numbers. And the consequence was that the official American record of the war understated civilian casualties by amounts that remain genuinely difficult to quantify today, because the original miscounting was so thorough. Soldiers who participated in or witnessed this process were, in many cases, aware of what they were doing or what was being done around them. And the awareness of it was one of the first significant moral erosions that happened to men in the field. Because recognizing that the numbers were false, recognizing that the dead being counted as enemy soldiers were not always or even primarily what the official record said they were, created a cognitive problem with no available solution. Reporting it accurately upward was likely to produce pressure, friction, career damage. Accepting the official framework required a kind of sustained compartmentalization, and the compartmentalization, maintained day after day, week after week, across a 12-month tour and sometimes beyond, did something to people. It did not always produce what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though it often contributed to that. It produced something more diffuse and harder to name, a background erosion of the sense that what you were doing and what was being said about what you were doing bore any relationship to each other. There was another dimension of the body count problem that received even less official acknowledgement, which was the treatment of South Vietnamese civilian casualties caused by American operations. The distinction between North Vietnamese regulars, Viet Cong insurgents, and South Vietnamese civilians was in theory clear and important. In practice, it was often impossible to maintain. The Viet Cong insurgency was embedded in the civilian population in ways that were structural and deliberate. Village populations in large parts of the country included men and women who were active participants in the insurgency, others who provided passive support, others who were entirely uninvolved and unwilling participants in a conflict taking place around them, and others who moved between these categories depending on circumstances. The American military's ability to distinguish between these groups, particularly from the air, from a moving patrol in a firefight in the dark, was limited in ways that the official operational framework rarely acknowledged. The consequence was that American operations caused substantial civilian casualties throughout the war, and the institutional response to those casualties was, at best, inadequate accounting, and at worst, deliberate reclassification. The soldiers who were involved in those operations knew this. They saw what had actually happened. They wrote letters home that were sometimes censored. They made statements to chaplains and medical personnel that occasionally made it into internal reports. What they did not do, in most cases, was produce the kind of formal documented record that would survive into the official history of the war, because the institutional incentives for producing such a record were essentially non-existent, and the incentives against it were substantial. The Free Fire Zone policy, which was formerly called a specified strike zone, or a reconnaissance zone in different periods and contexts, represented one of the most significant and least publicly discussed aspects of the war's legal and moral framework. The concept was that in areas designated as free fire zones, which were areas where civilian populations had been forcibly relocated or were presumed to have been relocated, any individual remaining could be treated as an enemy combatant and fired upon without prior warning or identification. The theory was that only combatants would remain in areas that had been cleared of civilians. The practice deviated from the theory in significant and sometimes catastrophic ways. Relocations were often incomplete. Civilians sometimes returned to their land after relocation, unable or unwilling to remain in crowded and inadequate relocation camps. The designation of zones was sometimes made based on incomplete or outdated information about where civilian populations actually were. And the enforcement of the zones, once designated, created situations where civilians were killed, not because they had been identified as threats, but because they were present in an area where presence itself was treated as evidence of hostile intent. Soldiers operating in these zones were living inside a policy framework that had been designed, at least in part, to simplify the legal and moral accounting of the war by pre-authorizing lethal force in defined geographic areas. The effect on the individual soldier's moral reasoning was significant. When the rules say that anyone in this area can be killed, and you are in this area killing people, the normal process of moral evaluation, the process of distinguishing threat from non-threat, combatant from civilian, necessary force from unnecessary force, that process gets suspended or distorted. Not immediately and not in every individual, but over time and across a population of soldiers operating in these conditions, the distortion accumulated, and it produced behaviors, incidents, patterns that the official record consistently struggled to characterize and consistently failed to fully account for. The war's relationship to truth became most acutely visible in what happened when soldiers reported things that the official narrative could not accommodate. There was an informal but powerful system of pressure in Vietnam that discouraged upward reporting of information that conflicted with the prevailing assessment of how the war was going. This pressure did not usually take the form of explicit orders not to report. It worked more subtly than that. It worked through the climate of what was welcomed and what was not, through the career consequences that attached to officers who were seen as bringing problems rather than solutions, through the general atmosphere in which optimistic assessments were rewarded and pessimistic ones were viewed as evidence of inadequate leadership rather than accurate observation. The intelligence community experienced this pressure intensely and experienced its distorting effects in ways that had direct consequences for military planning. Analysts who believed that enemy troop strength was higher than the official figures acknowledged, who believed that the insurgency was more deeply rooted than the official assessment suggested, who believed that the pacification programs were not producing the results being claimed for them, those analysts faced a consistent institutional headwind. Their assessments were questioned. Their methodologies were challenged. Their conclusions were revised in the course of moving through the review process, not because new evidence had emerged, but because the conclusions themselves were institutionally inconvenient. The most significant documented example of this was the dispute over enemy order of battle, the estimate of the total strength of enemy forces in Vietnam, which came to a head in 1967 but had been building for years. The debate was essentially about whether the official MACV figures, which showed enemy strength at levels the military could credibly claim to be containing and reducing, were accurate, or whether a substantially higher figure, one that would have included the full range of enemy military and paramilitary forces, more accurately reflected the actual situation. The implications of the dispute were enormous. If enemy strength was significantly higher than the official figures showed, then the claims being made about the progress of attrition, about the success of search and destroy operations, about the overall trajectory of the war, were not just inaccurate. They were systematically misleading the civilian leadership, Congress, and the American public about what was actually happening. The institutional response to analysts who argued for the higher figures was not to engage seriously with their evidence and methodology. It was to resist, pressure, and ultimately override their conclusions in favor of the numbers that fit the existing narrative. Soldiers in the field who encountered this pattern, who reported enemy activity that seemed inconsistent with the official assessments of enemy capability, who could see with their own eyes that the force they were fighting did not match the description of a force that was being successfully degraded. Those soldiers experienced a particular kind of disorientation. They were living inside a story whose official version bore no relationship to the version they were experiencing, and there was no available channel through which the truth of their experience could meaningfully travel upward to the people who were making decisions. The Tet Offensive in January 1968 was the event that made this gap publicly visible in a way that could not be managed or suppressed. The scale and coordination of the attacks, which struck simultaneously across more than 100 cities and towns throughout South Vietnam, including the grounds of the American embassy in Saigon, was simply impossible to reconcile with the official picture of a war in which the enemy was being steadily weakened and the tide was turning in America's favor. The Tet Offensive did not represent a communist military victory in strictly conventional terms. American and South Vietnamese forces repelled the attacks, inflicted enormous casualties on the attackers, and recovered the terrain that had been temporarily seized. But it was a devastating intelligence and credibility failure, because the official story had not allowed for the possibility of what had just happened. And the American public and Congress, confronted with televised images of the fighting at the embassy and across the country, made their own assessment of what the gap between the official story and the visible reality implied. What is less often discussed about the aftermath of Tet is what happened to the soldiers who had been, in the months and years before January 1968, living inside the gap between official reality and lived reality. For many of them, Tet was not a shock in the way it was a shock to civilians watching television in the United States. It was, in a dark and unsettling way, a confirmation. The enemy that appeared during Tet was the enemy they had been encountering and reporting in ways that had been minimized or dismissed. The capability that was suddenly undeniable had been present and visible to them for a long time. The gap that was suddenly public had been private and carried alone for months or years. And the experience of having that gap suddenly acknowledged in the most dramatic possible way, while also knowing that the official framework had systematically denied it, did something to the trust soldiers had in the institution they were serving. That erosion of trust did not announce itself loudly. It settled in quietly, and it shaped everything that came afterward. The conditions under which soldiers actually fought in Vietnam were themselves a source of sustained institutional misrepresentation that compounded over time. The 12-month tour rotation policy, which the Army adopted as a way of distributing the burden of combat service across as large a portion of the officer and enlisted force as possible, had consequences for unit cohesion and operational effectiveness that were understood fairly early and acknowledged almost not at all in official planning and reporting. The theory behind the 12-month rotation was reasonable enough. It prevented any cohort from bearing an indefinite share of the combat burden. It meant that the experience of Vietnam was spread across the military rather than concentrated in a single generation of soldiers. It maintained institutional continuity by cycling experienced men through the war rather than leaving them there indefinitely. The practice was different. Combat effectiveness in small unit warfare depends heavily on unit cohesion, on the shared experience and mutual knowledge that allows soldiers to predict each other's behavior under pressure, to trust each other's judgment in situations where there is no time for deliberation. Unit cohesion takes time to develop, and it can be destroyed very quickly. The 12-month rotation policy meant that units were in a constant state of partial replacement, with men rotating in and out at different times, with no two soldiers in a squad necessarily sharing the same amount of time together. A soldier who arrived in country and immediately began working with men who had 11 months of experience had a very different introduction to the war than the official training pipeline had prepared him for. And a soldier in his 11th month, trying to survive his final weeks, was operating with fundamentally different motivations and risk tolerances than a soldier in his 2nd month. This dynamic was understood at the level of individual soldiers, of platoon sergeants and company commanders. It was not unknown at higher levels of the command. But its implications, the ways it was actively degrading unit cohesion and combat effectiveness, were not things that the command climate encouraged officers to document and report formally. Because reporting them accurately would have meant acknowledging a fundamental problem with a central element of the Army's personnel policy, and that kind of acknowledgement was not something the institutional culture was prepared to receive or act on. The drug problem in Vietnam is another area where the gap between official recognition and lived reality was sustained across years and with significant consequences. Marijuana was widespread in Vietnam from relatively early in the American involvement, and by the late 1960s, drug use had expanded significantly to include heroin and other substances. The official response to drug use was enforcement, which ranged from cursory to serious, depending on the command, but which was consistently framed as a discipline and law enforcement problem. The framing was understandable from an institutional perspective. Acknowledging the scale of the drug problem would have required acknowledging the conditions that were producing it, the sustained exposure to combat stress, the moral erosion, the loss of purpose and direction, the absence of any framework that made the sacrifices being demanded comprehensible in terms of clear objectives or credible progress toward them. Soldiers who were using drugs were, in many cases, doing so not as recreational choice in the way the term might imply, but as a response to conditions that had already stripped other coping mechanisms away. The availability of heroin in Vietnam, its extraordinary purity and its remarkably low cost, made it accessible in ways that had no precedent in the American military's previous experience. Men who had never used any drug before their deployment became heroin addicts in Vietnam. And the system's response to addiction, when it acknowledged addiction at all, was predominantly punitive rather than therapeutic. Men who came forward about drug problems risked disciplinary action. The stigma attached to drug use made self-identification dangerous. And so, a significant portion of the drug use in Vietnam remained hidden from the official record, handled at the unit level through informal management that ranged from compassionate to brutal, never producing the kind of transparent institutional response that might have addressed the underlying conditions. When men rotated back to the United States with drug dependencies they had developed in Vietnam, the military's processing system was not configured to identify or address them. Urine screening at the point of departure from Vietnam was introduced later in the war, but the early years of the drug epidemic produced large numbers of veterans who returned with substance dependencies that were functionally invisible in their records, and that became individual problems for individuals to manage without institutional support. The official history of the drug problem in Vietnam underrepresents its scale, its depth, and its human cost, by amounts that remain difficult to estimate precisely because the suppression of information about it was so consistent. The war's relationship to race was another dimension of lived reality that the official record consistently mischaracterized. African American soldiers served in Vietnam in disproportionate numbers in combat roles and experienced disproportionate casualty rates, particularly in the early years of the large-scale American deployment. This was not accidental. It reflected patterns in the military's occupational assignment system, in the distribution of combat versus non-combat roles, in the pathways through which men ended up in the most dangerous positions. And it was compounded by conditions within the military that were themselves deeply shaped by the racial dynamics of American society at a moment when those dynamics were undergoing profound and sometimes violent transformation. African American soldiers in Vietnam were simultaneously fighting in a war they had been drafted into and experiencing a version of the racial tensions that were convulsing American cities at home. They received news of assassinations, of protests, of civil rights confrontations in letters and through stars and stripes, and through whatever media found its way into their units. They were serving under a command structure that was, at its senior levels, overwhelmingly white. They encountered in their units the same patterns of racial prejudice, the same assumptions, the same informal hierarchies that structured American society, compressed and intensified by the conditions of combat. The racial tensions within American units in Vietnam escalated significantly in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Fraternization patterns, informal segregation in rear areas, disputes over music and cultural expression, confrontations over perceived differential treatment in duty assignments. The accumulation of these tensions produced incidents that ranged from verbal confrontations to physical violence. Some of these incidents were documented. Many were managed informally, suppressed from the official record, handled at the unit level in ways that reflected the commanding officer's particular style and the unit's particular culture. The overall picture that the official record presents of race relations in Vietnam is substantially rosier than the picture that emerges from oral histories, from private correspondence, from the accounts of military chaplains and medical personnel who encountered the consequences of racial conflict in their work. The fragging phenomenon, which is the term used to describe the killing or attempted killing of American officers and NCOs by their own men, is one of the most dramatic indicators of how far the internal cohesion of the American military deteriorated over the course of the Vietnam War. Fragging typically involved the use of fragmentation grenades thrown into an officer's sleeping area, sometimes as a warning and sometimes with lethal intent. The phenomenon was real, documented to a degree, and substantially underreported. What made its way into official records represents a fraction of what actually occurred, because the incentive structure around reporting these incidents was complicated by the fact that they reflected catastrophically on unit cohesion and officer leadership, and because the circumstances in which they occurred often made definitive attribution impossible. The conditions that produced fragging were specific and understandable in a grim way. Men who had been in country for long periods, who had developed an intimate understanding of which leadership decisions were militarily sound and which were performative, which risks were necessary, and which were generated by an officer's need to demonstrate aggressiveness for career reasons. Those men sometimes made a calculation that their survival depended on removing the officer who was making the decisions they considered most dangerous. The logic was brutal and morally catastrophic, but it was not irrational given the context in which it occurred. Men who had watched friends die on operations they believed were unnecessary, who had no functional mechanism for legitimate protest, who understood that filing a complaint or refusing an order would produce consequences for them rather than for the officer they were complaining about. Those men sometimes concluded that the fragging option was the only one available. The command's response to fragging was not primarily to examine the conditions that were producing it. It was to treat it as a criminal matter, which it was, and to manage the information about its prevalence in ways that minimized its visibility. Officers who were fragged or who survived fragging attempts were not typically celebrated for their leadership qualities. The incidents were often handled in ways that minimized documentation, and the overall picture of fragging in Vietnam that entered the public record represents a significant undercount of its actual prevalence. There is a related phenomenon that received even less official acknowledgement, which is the much larger category of accidental or ambiguous deaths of officers and NCOs in combat situations. In the confusion of a firefight in the dark, in jungle terrain where friendly and enemy forces were often in extremely close proximity, it was possible for a man to be killed by fire from his own side in ways that were genuinely ambiguous. And in some cases, fire that killed an unpopular or dangerous officer was not genuinely ambiguous to the people who produced it, but was recorded as such because the alternative involved a criminal investigation that the unit and the command structure both had reasons to avoid. The precise scope of this phenomenon is impossible to quantify because the documentation was never generated in the first place. But soldiers who were in Vietnam and who speak honestly about it consistently describe it as real, as understood, within units, and as institutionally invisible. The rules of engagement in Vietnam were another area of sustained institutional confusion that produced consequences on the ground that the official framework was not configured to acknowledge. The rules of engagement were the formal instructions that governed when and how American forces could use lethal force. They were designed to serve multiple purposes simultaneously, to comply with the laws of war, to minimize civilian casualties, to maintain South Vietnamese sovereignty in ways that the political context required, and to allow American forces to fight effectively. These purposes were sometimes in tension with each other, and sometimes in direct contradiction with the conditions that soldiers were actually operating in. The result was a set of rules that were formally complex, frequently modified, differently interpreted at different levels of command, and practically unenforceable in the conditions of counterinsurgency warfare. Soldiers in the field operated in situations where the distinction between legitimate target and civilian was often impossible to make with confidence, where the sequence of events required by the rules of engagement, the warning, the identification, the graduated response bore no relationship to the speed and chaos of actual contact. They also operated in an environment where the consequences of following the rules rigidly might be their own deaths, and where the institutional enforcement of the rules was inconsistent in ways that reflected command priorities rather than principled application. The inconsistency of rules of engagement enforcement created a moral environment in Vietnam that was deeply corrosive. Men who killed in circumstances they understood to be legally ambiguous, or who were present when others did so, and who were not held accountable, received a lesson about what the rules actually meant in practice. Men who were held accountable, sometimes severely, for actions that seemed to them no different from actions for which others had faced no consequences, received a different but equally corrosive lesson. The overall effect was to produce a large population of soldiers who had internalized the lesson that the rules existed primarily as a management tool for the institution rather than as a genuine framework for distinguishing right from wrong, and who organized their moral reasoning accordingly. The pacification programs, the various American-led and South Vietnamese-led efforts to secure the rural population from Viet Cong control and bring it under effective government authority, represent another domain in which the gap between official reporting and actual results was sustained over years, with significant consequences. The pacification programs were central to the American theory of winning the war. If you could separate the insurgency from the population, eliminate its local infrastructure, provide security and basic services, build loyalty to the Saigon government, you could theoretically undercut the political and logistical base on which the Viet Cong depended. The theory was coherent. The execution was deeply flawed in ways that the metrics used to measure it consistently failed to capture. The Hamlet evaluation system, which was introduced in 1967 as a way of measuring the progress of pacification across South Vietnam's roughly 12,000 hamlets, produced detailed quantitative assessments of security and development conditions that were regular in their production, impressive in their specificity, and profoundly unreliable in their accuracy. The system assigned numerical ratings to conditions in each hamlet based on reports submitted by district advisors who were relying on information gathered in security conditions that often made direct observation impossible or dangerous. The ratings moved, over the years of the HES's operation, in a generally positive direction that showed steady progress in pacification. This positive trend was inconsistent with other indicators of the war's trajectory and inconsistent with the direct experience of the soldiers and advisors who were working in the field. The problems with the system were multiple and compounding. District advisors who submitted pessimistic ratings were not furthering their careers. Hamlet evaluations that showed no progress were not what the program's managers wanted to see. The metrics themselves were sometimes disconnected from the actual determinants of security and loyalty, measuring things that could be measured rather than things that mattered. And the underlying reality that the system was trying to capture, the degree to which rural South Vietnamese were genuinely protected from and committed against the Viet Cong, was something that the available data collection methods were fundamentally ill-suited to assess with any accuracy. The Phoenix program, which was the CIA-coordinated effort to neutralize the Viet Cong political infrastructure through capture, defection, or killing, operated in an environment of accountability that was, in some respects, even less rigorous than the general body count system. The program had numerical targets, monthly quotas for the number of Viet Cong infrastructure members to be neutralized, and it produced numbers that consistently met those targets. The problem, which was understood by people inside the program and by some of its external critics and which was never resolved through the program's operational existence, was that the categories of who counted as Viet Cong infrastructure and how you verified that the people being neutralized actually belonged to that category were deeply uncertain in ways that the pressure for numbers made worse rather than better. Provincial reconnaissance units, which were the paramilitary forces that carried out much of the Phoenix program's operational work, operated under conditions where accountability for their actions was minimal. Allegations of torture, of killing detainees, of settling personal scores under the cover of anti-infrastructure operations were persistent throughout the program's existence. Some of these allegations were investigated. Many were not. The program produced reports showing tens of thousands of Viet Cong infrastructure members neutralized over its operational life, and the relationship between those numbers and what actually happened in the field is one of the more consequential unresolved questions of the war's record. American soldiers who worked alongside or in support of Phoenix operations, who saw the conditions of detainee handling, who were present when things happened that the program's official record did not acknowledge, those soldiers carried knowledge that had no official receptacle. The program's classified status meant that even the limited mechanisms for public accountability that applied to regular military operations did not apply here. and the knowledge those soldiers carried became part of the vast, informal archive of Vietnam War experience that existed entirely outside the official record. The treatment of prisoners in Vietnam, both of American prisoners in North Vietnamese captivity and of Vietnamese prisoners in American and South Vietnamese hands, is an area where the official narrative was shaped as much by what was not said as by what was. American prisoners in North Vietnamese captivity were subjected to systematic torture and coercive treatment that the North Vietnamese publicly denied, and that the American government was long constrained in acknowledging, because doing so would have required diplomatic and military responses that were politically complex. The men who survived that captivity carried knowledge of what had been done to them that was, for extended periods, difficult to speak publicly about in ways that were fully honest. The treatment of Vietnamese prisoners in American and South Vietnamese custody is a different, and in some ways more complicated area. The Geneva Conventions applied. American policy, formally stated, required humane treatment of prisoners. The practice, in the field, in the immediate aftermath of combat, in the intelligence collection process that happened before prisoners were transferred to formal detention facilities, was inconsistent in ways that ranged from fully compliant to severely abusive. The abuses that occurred were sometimes documented by witnesses, sometimes investigated, and sometimes prosecuted. More often they were not, for reasons that had to do with the conditions under which they occurred, with the institutional culture of the units involved, and with the fact that the victims were Vietnamese prisoners, about whom little sustained institutional concern existed. American military and civilian advisors who witnessed South Vietnamese mistreatment of prisoners faced a particular dilemma. Their authority to intervene was limited. Their ability to report upward without consequence to their own relationships and effectiveness was constrained, and the policy framework that governed their role generally emphasized maintaining South Vietnamese cooperation and sovereignty in ways that complicated direct intervention in South Vietnamese actions, even clearly abusive ones. The advisors who tried to report what they saw, who tried to change practices through legitimate channels, often found that the channels were not designed to absorb that kind of report, and that the consequences of persistent reporting were borne primarily by the reporter. There was a particular category of information in Vietnam that was not exactly classified and not exactly secret, but that was subject to a form of informal institutional suppression that was, in some ways, more effective than formal classification. This was information about the mental health consequences of combat service in Vietnam. The military's official approach to combat stress in Vietnam was shaped by lessons taken from World War II and Korea, which suggested that removing soldiers from combat for psychiatric reasons was often counterproductive, that the treatment of acute combat stress reactions close to the unit and with rapid return to duty produced better outcomes than evacuation and hospitalization. There was genuine clinical evidence supporting some aspects of this approach. The application of it in Vietnam, however, produced results that the official mental health statistics did not capture with any accuracy. The doctrine of treating combat stress in forward locations and returning soldiers to duty as quickly as possible meant that men who were experiencing significant psychiatric consequences of their combat exposure were often not recorded as psychiatric casualties. They were treated and returned. Their treatment episode might generate a record, or it might not, and the underlying conditions that produced the episode continued because the soldier was returned to the same environment that had generated the stress reaction. The official psychiatric casualty figures for Vietnam were, for this reason, substantial underestimates of the actual psychiatric impact of combat service on the men involved. What was being called acute combat stress reaction in Vietnam and what was being managed through the forward treatment doctrine often involved symptoms that would subsequently be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD as a diagnostic category did not exist during the Vietnam War. It was developed substantially in response to the clinical experience of Vietnam veterans through the work of psychiatrists and psychologists who were seeing patterns of symptoms in veterans that the existing diagnostic framework could not adequately capture. The development of the PTSD diagnosis in the years after the war acknowledged, at the level of clinical psychiatry, what the military's own data collection systems had spent years systematically undercounting. The veterans who returned from Vietnam and struggled with what would subsequently be recognized as PTSD did so, in the early years after their return, without that clinical framework available to them. They did so in a social environment that was hostile or indifferent in ways that complicated help-seeking. They did so in a VA system that was underfunded, understaffed, and not configured to deal with the scale or the specific nature of what they were presenting. And the silence in which they lived with their experiences, a silence enforced partly by stigma, partly by the absence of an available language for what they had been through, became a kind of second archive of the war, as real and as consequential as the official record, and almost entirely absent from it. The question of what soldiers were formally and informally forbidden to say about their experiences while still in service is one that does not have a simple answer, because the mechanisms of suppression were varied and not always distinguishable from the ordinary institutional culture of a military at war. There were formal classification systems, specific operations, specific intelligence methods, specific command decisions were classified, and soldiers who knew about them were legally constrained in what they could say. The classification system was applied broadly and sometimes inconsistently, covering information whose primary sensitive quality was its political embarrassment rather than its genuine national security implications. But beyond formal classification, there were the informal mechanisms, the awareness that certain topics were unwelcome in official channels, the career consequences that attached to officers who consistently brought inconvenient information upward, the culture of unit solidarity that made speaking outside the unit about what had happened inside it feel like a form of betrayal, regardless of what those events actually were. The stigma attached to men who were seen as unable to handle what they had seen, which discouraged honest reporting of psychological symptoms. The general atmosphere in which the official narrative about the war was treated, at least in official settings, as the correct narrative, and departures from it were treated as evidence of personal failure or political unreliability rather than as accurate reporting. The soldiers who came home and tried to tell people what Vietnam was actually like often found that the available audience was divided between those who wanted to hear a story that confirmed the war's justice and those who wanted to hear a story that confirmed its injustice. Neither of those audiences was really interested in the more complicated thing, which was the description of a war that had not been what either side's narrative required it to be. A war that was characterized above all by ambiguity, by the systematic substitution of metrics for meaning, by the slow erosion of the distinction between truth and useful fiction, by the experience of serving inside an institution that had convinced itself it was winning a war it did not understand how to win. The air war over North Vietnam, which escalated dramatically with Operation Rolling Thunder beginning in 1965 and continued in various forms through most of the American involvement, generated its own distinctive version of the truth-fiction gap. The bombing campaign was sold to civilian leadership and to the public as a tool of coercion, a way of inflicting costs on North Vietnam that would force it to negotiate and to reduce its support for the southern insurgency. The internal debate about the campaign's effectiveness was sustained throughout its operation, with significant elements of the intelligence community and the military itself questioning whether the bombing was achieving its stated objectives. Those doubts were not consistently reflected in the official assessments that were presented to civilian leadership and to Congress. The pilots who flew the missions, who could see what they were hitting and what they were not hitting, who returned to carriers and air bases with their own observations about the relationship between the targets they had been assigned and the actual operational capability of North Vietnam's military and industrial infrastructure. Those pilots were operating inside a campaign whose strategic logic was contested in ways that the briefings they received did not fully reflect. The restrictions on targeting that were imposed for political reasons, the avoidance of certain targets near the Chinese border, the protection of certain areas to preserve negotiating leverage, The pauses in the bombing that were intended to signal willingness to negotiate and were interpreted by the North Vietnamese as evidence of irresolving commitment, all of these factors were understood at the operational level to be shaping the campaign in ways that the strategic objectives could not accommodate. The loss rate in the air campaign was substantial. American pilots were being killed and captured at rates that made the human cost of the bombing campaign visible in a way that its strategic results were not. And the intelligence about what the bombing was actually accomplishing, about North Vietnamese industrial and military capability before and after the strikes, about the effectiveness of the interdiction campaign against the supply routes that were sustaining the southern insurgency. That intelligence was read and assessed in ways that reflected the institutional investment in the campaign, rather than dispassionate analysis of the evidence. The ground war's logic was similarly self-reinforcing in ways that made honest assessment difficult from within the institution. Search and destroy, the dominant operational concept for much of the American war, was based on a theory of attrition. The idea that by finding and killing enough enemy soldiers, you could ultimately degrade the enemy's ability to continue fighting. The theory had a certain mechanical coherence. The practice had problems that were structural and not solvable through more aggressive application of the same approach. The enemy in Vietnam was fighting a war with a different theory of victory, one that was based not on winning firefights or holding territory, but on sustaining the conflict until the political will of the United States to continue it collapsed. Under this theory, losing tactically in any individual engagement was acceptable as long as the overall level of violence and the overall pace of American casualties were sufficient to maintain pressure on domestic American public opinion. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese regulars could choose when to fight and when to avoid contact. They could absorb enormous casualties because their political framework told them that those casualties were the price of ultimate victory. And the operational logic of search and destroy, which required the enemy to engage in order to produce the body counts that demonstrated success, was consistently frustrated by an enemy that had no obligation to provide those engagements on terms that were favorable to the American approach. Soldiers who spent months in the jungle on search and destroy operations, finding little, losing men to ambushes and booby traps, returning to base with results that did not justify the cost, and then watching those operations be written up in reports that framed them as successful, those soldiers understood something fundamental about the war that the institution could not formally acknowledge. The operations were not finding and destroying the enemy. They were creating contact on terms that the enemy controlled. And the reporting of those operations as successful was not an honest accounting of what had happened, but an act of institutional self-preservation. The advisory relationship between American military advisors and the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, was another area where the official narrative diverged from lived experience in ways with enormous consequences. American military doctrine held that the ultimate objective of the American involvement was to build South Vietnamese military capability to the point where the South could defend itself without American forces. This was the theory of Vietnamization, which was given its formal name under the Nixon administration, but which had been at least formally present in American planning from the beginning of the large-scale involvement. The gap between the theory and the practice was one of the war's most significant and least honestly assessed dimensions. American advisors who worked closely with ARVN units, who understood the actual capability and institutional culture of those units, who saw the effects of South Vietnamese military leadership selection processes that were shaped by political loyalty rather than competence, who understood the corruption that affected logistics, pay, and equipment. Those advisors often had assessments of South Vietnamese military capability that were profoundly at odds with the official evaluations that moved through the reporting system. The official evaluations were produced under the same incentive structure as all other metrics in the war. Reporting that the unit you were advising was ineffective, corrupt, or unwilling to fight reflected on your effectiveness as an advisor as much as on the unit itself. The path of least resistance was evaluations that found progress, that identified improvement, that managed upward the picture of an ARVN that was developing towards self-sufficiency. The American military's unwillingness to honestly assess South Vietnamese military capability to address the structural problems in ARVN leadership and logistics, to acknowledge that the foundation on which the entire strategy of Vietnamization depended was much weaker than the official reporting suggested. This unwillingness had direct consequences for what happened after American forces withdrew. The collapse of South Vietnam in 1975 was not entirely surprising to people who had been inside the advisory relationship and who had formed honest assessments of what ARVN was and was not capable of. It was shocking to people who had relied on the official reporting, which had consistently described an improving South Vietnamese military moving toward genuine self-sufficiency. The last years of American involvement in Vietnam, from roughly 1969 through 1973, saw a deterioration of the American military's institutional cohesion that was more severe and more broadly distributed than anything the official record captured at the time. The combination of factors was unprecedented, a war whose purpose could not be clearly articulated to the men fighting it. A draft system that was perceived, with substantial justification, as falling more heavily on some Americans than others. A domestic political environment in which the war was contested in ways that were visible to the soldiers fighting it. A drug availability that had no historical precedent in American military experience. Racial tensions that mirrored and sometimes exceeded those in American society at large. A leadership culture that had been shaped by the distorting incentive structures of years of misrepresentation. The cumulative effect on discipline, cohesion, and operational effectiveness was visible to anyone who was paying honest attention. The official response to this deterioration was not to honestly characterize it or to address its underlying causes. It was to manage it, to selectively enforce discipline in ways that maintained a sufficient level of order to sustain operations while not acknowledging the full scope of what was happening, to continue the drawdown in ways that removed the most demoralized and difficult units from the equation, to maintain the appearance of military effectiveness for the duration of the negotiations that were supposed to be ending the American involvement on terms that were at least rhetorically acceptable. The Paris Peace Accords, signed in January 1973, were presented as an achievement, as the conclusion of a process that had produced an honorable end to American involvement. The men who had been in Vietnam, who understood the actual relationship between the political settlement and the military situation on the ground, who knew what the North Vietnamese had agreed to and what their actual intentions were. Many of them did not share the official characterization of what had been accomplished. The accords were, in the assessment of many people who knew the situation well, a mechanism that allowed American withdrawal to proceed while maintaining a fiction of South Vietnamese viability that could not be sustained for long once American military support was removed. The men who had fought in Vietnam and who had come home before 1973 were, by the time the accords were signed, largely invisible to the national conversation about the war. The anti-war movement had shaped the public image of Vietnam veterans in ways that many veterans found deeply objectionable. The pro-war movement had shaped it in ways that were no more accurate, and the veterans themselves, with their complicated and often mutually contradictory experiences, their awareness of things that neither the official narrative nor the anti-war narrative had room for, were largely unable to find an audience for the particular kind of truth they carried. The Veterans Administration in the years immediately after Vietnam was not prepared for what the veterans of that war brought with them. The scale of the drug dependency problem, the scale of the unrecognized psychiatric consequences of combat exposure, the scale of the physical health consequences that would eventually be associated with Agent Orange and other chemical exposures. None of these were things that the VA's resources, culture, or organizational structure were designed to address in the early 1970s. The veterans who needed help most, who had been most profoundly damaged by their service, were in many cases the least able to navigate the system that was supposed to help them, and the least visible to the institutional actors who might have advocated for them. Agent Orange, The herbicide mixture that was sprayed over millions of acres of Vietnamese territory to destroy vegetation that provided cover for enemy forces represents one of the most significant long-term consequences of the war that was most systematically ignored for the longest time. The health effects of dioxin exposure, which was a contaminant present in the Agent Orange mixture, were not unknown to scientists at the time of the spraying. The manufacturers knew. Elements of the government knew. The decision was made to proceed with the spraying program because the military utility was judged to outweigh the risk, and the men who were sprayed, who worked in areas that had been sprayed, who drank water contaminated by the spraying, were not told what they had been exposed to or what the potential consequences might be. The subsequent decades-long fight by Vietnam veterans to have their Agent Orange-related health conditions recognized and compensated was a continuation of the same dynamic that had characterized the war itself. Veterans with conditions they believed were related to their chemical exposure were confronted with an institutional response that denied the connection, demanded levels of individual proof that were essentially impossible to provide, and moved at a pace that meant many veterans died of their conditions before any compensation was forthcoming. The eventual acknowledgement of the Agent Orange health claims, the creation of the presumptive condition list that recognized certain cancers and other conditions as service-connected for Vietnam veterans with relevant exposure histories, represented a formal institutional acknowledgement that came decades after the damage had been done, and that still did not reach every veteran who had been affected. The Vietnamese people who were exposed to Agent Orange, who lived in the areas that were most heavily sprayed, who continued to experience elevated rates of certain cancers and birth defects associated with dioxin exposure, their situation received for a very long time even less institutional acknowledgement than the American veterans. The Vietnamese government made claims. The American government disputed them. The scientific evidence was contested in the way that scientific evidence involving large corporate and governmental interests typically is, and the actual human beings living with the consequences in the Mekong Delta and the highland regions where the spraying was most intense continued to bear those consequences largely outside the sight lines of the international attention and compensation that the severity of the health effects would seem to require. The land itself in Vietnam bears evidence of the war that persists in ways that the official accounts of the conflict rarely address. Unexploded ordnance, the bombs and artillery shells and landmines and cluster munitions that were not detonated during the war continue to kill and injure Vietnamese civilians decades after the fighting ended. The United States dropped more bomb tonnage on Indochina than was dropped by all sides in all of World War II. A significant percentage of all ordnance dropped is statistically expected to fail to detonate on impact. The arithmetic of those two facts produces a continuing human cost that is borne by Vietnamese farmers, children, and others who encounter unexploded ordnance in the course of daily life. The pace of cleanup is measured in generations. The commitment of resources to that cleanup from the country that did most of the bombing has been episodic rather than systematic. The official American narrative of the Vietnam War has, over the decades since the fall of Saigon, undergone a kind of gradual rehabilitation that is in some ways more subtle and more consequential than an outright falsification would be. The most damaging truths have not been denied. They have been acknowledged, contextualized, and ultimately absorbed into a narrative of national learning, of wounds healed and lessons applied, that renders them less actively disruptive than they might otherwise be. The war is described as a tragedy. The men who fought it are honored for their service in a way that was absent in the immediate post-war years. The memorial on the National Mall is beautiful and genuinely moving. And the overall effect of this process of rehabilitation is to produce a settled historical account in which the specific institutional failures, the specific acts of misrepresentation, the specific choices made by specific people with specific consequences are diffused into a general atmosphere of regret that does not require precise accountability. The soldiers who carried the specific knowledge, the ones who were present when the specific things happened, the ones who filed the reports that were modified as they traveled upward, the ones who watched the body counts get inflated, the ones who saw the prisoners, the ones who flew the missions that were supposed to be achieving objectives they did not believe were being achieved. Those soldiers are dying. The living population of Vietnam veterans is aging in the way that all populations age, and the specific knowledge they carry is not being systematically collected or preserved in ways that would allow it to do the kind of work that a full historical accounting requires. The veterans who did speak, who wrote memoirs, who gave oral histories, who testified before Congress and spoke at universities, contributed enormously to the public record of the war. But the veterans who spoke, who found the words and the audience and the willingness to relive what they had been through in enough detail to be useful as historical record, those veterans are a particular kind of person, not necessarily more honest than the others, but more able or more driven to make the translation from private knowledge to public account. There is a vast population of Vietnam experience that lived and died in the space between private knowledge and public account, that never found its way into any record, that was carried in the silence of men who did not have the words or the audience or the willingness to make the transfer. That silence is itself part of the war's history. It is not incidental to what Vietnam was. The silence was produced by specific conditions, by the institutional culture that discouraged honest reporting, by the social conditions that made returning veterans invisible or unwelcome, by the psychological conditions that made the experience itself difficult to revisit with the precision that honest accounting requires, by the simple statistical reality that the life expectancies of men who came home with drug dependencies and untreated psychiatric conditions were shorter than those of men who did not. The silence is what the official record looks like when you subtract from it everything that the institution decided not to record, everything that the men involved could not bring themselves to say, everything that would have made the official story unworkable. The war in Vietnam officially ended for the United States in 1973 and officially ended for everyone in April 1975, when the last helicopter lifted off the embassy roof in Saigon and the North Vietnamese forces entered the city. The date is clear. The meaning of the ending is not. The war had been fought for a purpose that had become, over the years of the American involvement, progressively more difficult to articulate in terms that bore any relationship to what was actually happening on the ground. It had been sustained through a system of measurement and reporting that had replaced truth with useful fiction so comprehensively and for so long that the institution had lost the capacity to honestly assess its own position. It had consumed, over the course of the large-scale American involvement, more than 58,000 American lives, and Vietnamese lives on all sides in numbers that continue to be disputed, but that are measured in millions. The soldiers who had fought it, who had carried its specific and often unacknowledged realities in their bodies and their minds, came home to a country that had no adequate place for what they knew. The things they had been forbidden to reveal, the things that had been systematically suppressed and misreported and ignored, did not disappear because they had been suppressed. They continued in the experience of the men who carried them, in the health consequences of chemical exposure, in the effects of untreated trauma, in the quieter and less dramatic forms of damage that do not make it into official records or public accounts. And the institutional frameworks that had produced the misrepresentation, the incentive structures that had rewarded optimistic reporting and penalized honest assessment, the command cultures that had prioritized metrics over truth, the political environments that had demanded success and received the appearance of it, those frameworks did not end with the war either. They were modified, in some respects learned from, in some respects perpetuated. The specific lessons of Vietnam about the dangers of substituting measurable proxies for actual objectives, about the costs of institutional cultures that suppress inconvenient information, about the gap between what an institution knows and what it is willing to officially acknowledge. Those lessons were absorbed to varying degrees and forgotten in varying degrees. The men who had been there, who had known the specific texture of the specific thing, who had watched the numbers get inflated and the reports get softened and the dead get recategorized and the truth get translated into something the institution could absorb. Those men went on with their lives. Most of them did not become public voices. Most of them carried what they knew in the ordinary places where people carry things that cannot easily be said. And they aged, and some of them died, and the knowledge they carried narrowed with them. The war itself did not end in any complete sense on the days when it was officially declared over. The ordnance remained in the ground, the dioxin remained in the soil and the bodies. The institutional habits that had produced the misrepresentation remained in the organizations that had cultivated them. The psychological consequences remained in the men who had not been able to leave them in the jungle when their tours ended. And the official record, comprehensive in its volume and sparse in its honesty, remained what it was, which was the version of events that the institution had been able to produce, shaped by every pressure and incentive that had operated throughout the war to make that record something other than a full accounting of what had actually happened. In 1975, after the last American personnel had been evacuated and the South Vietnamese government had collapsed and the war was over in every practical sense, the fighting in Southeast Asia continued. The Khmer Rouge consolidated control in Cambodia. Conflict continued in Laos. The region that had been the theater of American military operations for a decade continued to experience violence and displacement in patterns that bore direct relationship to the disruptions the American involvement had produced. The men who had served in Vietnam were by then scattered across the United States and living civilian lives, or trying to, and the region they had fought in was still, in various ways, burning. The last American prisoner of war to be returned from Vietnam came home in 1973, under the terms of the Paris Accords. Subsequent decades brought persistent questions about whether all prisoners had in fact been returned, questions that were investigated and disputed, and that occupied a disproportionate amount of the emotional energy of the post-war political discussion about Vietnam, relative to the larger questions about what the war had been and what it had done. The MIA question, the question of what had happened to the Americans who were listed as missing in action and whose remains had not been recovered, became, in the post-war years, a focal point for a grief and anger that could not fully attach itself to the larger accountings, because those accountings were too diffuse, too institutional, too difficult to resolve into the specific human terms that grief requires. The war happened. It happened in specific places, to specific people who did specific things and had specific things done to them. The numbers that were produced to describe it were not accurate. The reports that were written to characterize it were not honest. The official accounts that were compiled to record it were shaped by every pressure that had operated throughout to prevent honest reckoning with what it actually was. And the men who were inside it, who knew it from the inside in ways that the official record could not capture, carried that knowledge in the only place it could be carried, which was in themselves, and they carried it for as long as they lived, and then they stopped.